What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Book Binge, where this week we are doing part 3, question mark? Yeah, we're doing part 3 of my 2022 reading tier list, where I rank everything that I read over the course of the year 2022. Now, I was originally thinking that this tier list series thing would be only 3 videos, where I covered about 15 books in each video. It turns out that I like to talk a little bit more than I had anticipated, even though I had anticipated me talking a lot, but that's fine. This is part 3 out of what is going to be 5 of these videos. So I hope you have enjoyed what I have released thus far. If you have not watched the first 2 parts of this, I recommend you go back and check those out because, well, you'll be behind on why I have some things placed where they are. But with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and reiterate the rule that I have for this tier list is that, well, I'm doing this all off the top of my head, so some of the rankings and placements of some of these books is going to seem a little bit weird, and indeed, a couple of them seem a little bit weird to me, to the point that one of the placements that I actually had initially done in the first video, I actually switched around in the second video because it seemed a little bit weird to me. So just, be aware of that fact that some of this stuff is, like I said, off the top of my head and isn't pre-prepped ahead of time. I'm not putting I'm putting a little bit of thought into this, but I'm not putting so much thought as to have them all pre-ranked ahead of time. And that's really it. Oh no, why is my display capture? There we go. Now it's working. Okay. Let's go ahead and talk about more of the books that I read in 2022, starting with Song of Susanna. Now, in part 1, I did the first 10 of these entries. In part 2, I did another 9 of them. The reason that I did not do a 10th one in part 2 was because Song of Susanna was the next book that I read over the course of the year. And, well, I wanted to be able to talk about Song of Susanna in conjunction with The Dark Tower for a reason, so that's why I cut off that video. Also, that video was getting a little bit long. So, let's go ahead and talk about Song of Susanna, Book 6 of The Dark Tower by Stephen King. This is one that most fans, I would say, label as probably their least favorite, barring Wind Through the Keyhole, because Wind Through the Keyhole is also a common one to see at bottom of list rankings. But Song of Susanna is quite frequently at the very bottom of that list, and honestly, I think for fairly good reason. It is definitely the messiest of the 8 books, in my opinion, and it spends a lot of time, obviously, with the title character being Susanna in the series, and I think Susanna is probably my least favorite of the quartet by a pretty strong margin. So even though there's a lot of crazy and, in a lot of instances, cool stuff that happens in this book, some of it fell flat compared to what it could have, just because I'm not a huge fan of Susanna's character, generally speaking, or other characters associated with her. Um, Plus, the main reason that I actually dislike this book, like from a more objective basis, is because it doesn't have a climax. What I mean by that is I'll compare it with The Wastelands and Wizard and Glass, which appeared earlier in the series. The Wastelands falls somewhat flat for me, hence being in pretty dang good instead of the cream of the crop, because the climax is cut in half, and then the remainder of the climax is part 1 of Wizard and Glass, whereas part 1 of Wizard and Glass could have been in The Wastelands, and both of those books probably would have been better off for it. Similar thing happened here, where there just isn't a climax for Song of Susanna. It's arguably worse than The Wastelands in that way, because The Wastelands at least had part of the climax. Song of Susanna doesn't have one. Like, you literally have characters walking into a building to do the thing that the climax is supposed to do, and then it doesn't happen. That's the end of that part of the book. Like, that's just the end of it. So, there are some problems with it because of that. And like I said, some of the other elements of the book in general, I just wasn't a huge fan of in the first place. So when you combine that fact with the fact that there is no climax, this book is probably better luck next time material. There's plenty of good stuff in it, and even the meta stuff that King started to introduce in Wolves of the Kala, I did not dislike in Song of Susanna. In fact, I think that that was actually probably the best part of that book. Quite frankly, it was probably my favorite part of the book was the meta stuff. But like I said, no climax and the messy stuff with the title character in terms of my enjoying the content within was easily the most mixed book that I've been the most mixed on a book I've been at any point over the course of 2022. So, Song of Susanna definitely belongs at the very bottom of this, in my opinion. But that moves into The Dark Tower, which is the seventh book, the finale of The Dark Tower. Now, this book, I'm actually part of the minority of people who actually love this book. Part one of The Dark Tower could very well have been at the end of Song of Susanna. Song of Susanna would have been a far better book because of it, and The Dark Tower's quality would not have changed very much, if at all. But part one was very good. Like, I just liked everything about this book. I'm not going to gush too much about it because I already did a review where I tried to gush about it in a spoiler-free context. I also did a tier list, a ranking. I didn't do a tier list, sorry. I did a ranking of the entire series where I gushed about this book a ton. And it's hard to gush about the book without going into spoilers. I just loved pretty much everything about The Dark Tower, including things that most people did not like. There's a particular character that shows up in the series that got a somewhat untimely demise in this book that I can totally see people being disappointed by, but because I did not read other things with that character in it, it didn't really impact me a whole lot, and I thought it did kind of cool things with the one of the other villains of the book as well. So I didn't hate that too much. I thought the pacing was very good, even when characters were just kind of traveling across the wilderness in certain sections of it, where a lot of people were like, "This is boring and slow," blah blah blah. And I don't feel that way personally. I absolutely love this book. Even the finale with the Crimson King and everything, just so good. And a lot of people are disappointed by elements of the finale. I was not. And the fact that Stephen King made the essentially the quote unquote epilogue of this book technically had two epilogues. It had an epilogue which was fantastic, amazing, beautiful. I love the epilogue so much. But it also had a coda where most of that coda is basically a second epilogue and the true finale and conclusion of the series. And it is so poignant and good. I just love it. I'm not going to gush about this anymore. This goes at the very top of this list. Easy. I love Wizarding Glass, don't get me wrong, but there are problems with it, especially with part one being, the remainder of the Wastelands climax in ways that just kind of felt off. And I wasn't the biggest fan of the final part of Wizarding Glass, actually. I just really love parts 2 and 3 a lot. Whereas The Dark Tower, I think pretty much everything about it is essentially perfect, at least to me. So that is where that goes. And next we talk about Another Kingdom, a very different book by Andrew Clavin. This one is, in a way, I guess you could consider it portal fantasy. And the way that it uses those portal fantasy elements was just so bizarre and unique and well done and thought out in a way that I really appreciated. Like, I'm surprised at how well it works. Like, you can tell that Andrew had the entire series planned out and like all the mechanics of the world planned out ahead of time because wow, this thing is plotted so well. It is very good. I listened to this one on audio, so I'm not a huge audiobook fan or listener. In fact, I did a few audiobooks this year, but I'm not prone to do them super often. But Another Kingdom, all three books in it, I did on audio this year because they're free with the Daily Wire subscription. So I did that. Another Kingdom was surprisingly enjoyable. It wasn't like fantastic or out of this world, but like I was expecting to go in and just be like, okay, well, this is just something I'm doing on the side. That's fine. And then I turned out really enjoying this book. It was really good. I'm going to put this, um, I'm going to put this just above The Lightning Thief because it was very good. It had a lot of great elements to it. A lot of characters were great and super memorable. It was plotted super well. I just enjoyed the whole thing. Now we talk about War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. Now this one is kind of weirdly placed on the list because I actually started reading this one back in February of 2022. However, I didn't finish it until July, where this is placed. These books are ranked in order, or at least listed in order of when I finished them. So War and Peace was one that I really enjoyed. It was such a big, chunky book, but for whatever reason, I don't actually think it's perfect question mark. There are a lot of great scenes. There are tons of great moments. I actually think the war sections of the book are the least enjoyable parts of it, strangely enough. I think the interpersonal character relationships and interactions are the best elements of this book by a significant degree. and they're just so enjoyable. It makes you really feel and understand and appreciate these characters to a very strong degree. And the way a lot of those, threads wrap up and conclude and intermingle and intertwine with each other is truly masterful. And the end of the book is very good. Epilogue 1 is an even better conclusion to the story. And even the dreaded Epilogue 2, which most people absolutely loathe, I rather enjoyed. I think 3 or 4 of the chapters I think it's like 14 chapters or something. I think about 3 of the chapters near the end of it could have been cut because Tolstoy started going around in a catch-22 type of circle that he just didn't find a way out of for several chapters. But other than a few of those chapters, I even really enjoyed Epilogue 2, and a lot of people are just like, well, it's not good because he just explores all the themes and topics that he just already did masterfully through the story. Nay, I say, I am of the opinion that the times that Tolstoy goes into the philosophical and historical moments throughout the story, especially in the first 2 or 3, especially in the first 3 volumes, I didn't enjoy those moments as much because it was cutting away from the main story in a way that I did not enjoy. It just felt like him rambling at those times. Whereas Epilogue 2 was like a series of essays where he took some of the themes and topics of the entire book and then just did a series of essays on them, going from one topic to the next until he got into Catch-22 at the end. So for me, I even really enjoyed Epilogue 2. This one is going to go in cream of the crop. It is definitely going to go into the bottom of cream of the crop because, like I said, there are some of those philosophical and historical moments throughout volumes like 1 and 2, especially, I was not particularly interested in. And even though the rest of it is very good, there are parts of it that, for whatever reason, I just don't think of this book as being an absolute favorite of mine, the way that I do some other books that I read, like, say, Frankenstein, which I would still say is an absolute favorite. But yeah, it definitely deserves to be in cream of the crop. But this is one that people should actually go and read. It is not nearly so bad as people think it is. Like, it's intimidating because of its size and nothing more. The writing, very good, very approachable. So if you haven't read it yet and you're in for something big, do it. I highly recommend it. You won't be disappointed. Now, we're going to talk about The Nightmare Feast by Andrew Clavin, which is Another Kingdom, number 2. Now, this one definitely suffers from middle book syndrome. In fact, to the point that trying to recall moments from the audio is that pretty much all of my memories of this series come from book 3. Several come from book 1, and like one scene I can remember from book 2, actually. I don't remember book 2 pretty much at all. It was not super eventful, and it was definitely more of a bridge from book 1 to book 3 than anything else. Like, this suffers from middle book syndrome, almost the worst example of it that I've personally experienced. It's not bad, but I don't remember pretty much anything that happened, and therefore it is rough around the edges, and I'm going to probably put it even below Brave New World because I don't remember pretty much anything of it. I only remember a couple scenes, and those scenes were pretty good, admittedly, but the fact that I don't remember anything else from it for whatever reason, even though I remember a lot from books 1 and 3, definitely says something about the book. Now, this is one that a lot of people are probably going to be upset with me over, that being The Obscene Bird of Night by Jose Donoso. Now, this is another magical realism book, except this is the actual Latin American magical realism from Chile, I believe, is where this book is set, and I believe that's where the author's from. I'm not 100% certain. If I'm wrong on that, I apologize. But this book was one that was incredibly hyped up by a group of my friends on Discord who were reading it, I would guess in late spring and early summer of last year. And then I decided to surprise them by reading it in July and not telling them and being able to tell them in August, hey, I read the Bird book. I didn't like it very much. And that's pretty much exactly what happened. I did not enjoy this book. I really loved part 1. In fact, if part 1 was all that this book was, I probably would have rated it 5 stars. Like, at least 4, notably, like a 4.5. But it could have been 5 stars for sure. Part 2 was absolutely god-awful, terrible. I cannot stand part 2 at all. I hate it every single time I think about it. Because I'm not going to rant too much because I already talked about this in a review that I did earlier, both on Goodreads and a video review that I did. I did not like part 2 at all. Part 3 kind of made part 2 less bad in memory to an extent because it actually made things come together in a way that was like, okay, I guess that's what part 2 was, question mark. But otherwise, part 3 was really long and boring and slow in ways that I did not enjoy. I'm sure there's a lot of thematic potency to it, but I had problems even with that because I was not reading the book for those parts of it personally at the time. This is a book that, even though I didn't enjoy it, I could see myself rereading specifically for trying to dig deeper into it since I'm familiar with the actual story of it. But eh, better luck next time for this one, dude. Like, and truthfully, better luck next time because it is one that I could see myself rereading again in the future. Like I said, I did not enjoy The Obscene Bird of Night. I really loved part 1, but the rest of it was like take it or leave it. In fact, just leave it because I will not take it. So that is where that one is going to go, just because I have such begrudging memories for part 2 primarily. Next, we're going to talk about The Emperor's Sword by Andrew Clavin, which is part 3 of Another Kingdom. This book was actually incredible, to be honest. Like, Another Kingdom was a very good introduction to this series. Emperor's Soul was a fantastic conclusion. Almost everything that I remember about this series was from, like I said, some of them were from book 1, but almost everything that I remember best about the series is from book 3. And it is great. Like, the climax of everything is so good. The way that Clavin intermingles elements from the previous books, even though I don't remember any elements from part 2, and plot threads and characters and motivations and themes and everything about it is surprisingly good. Like, it's just this is a series that even I would consider popcorn reads because they're not super crazy intense. They were just fun. But I really, really liked The Emperor's Soul a lot. Or sorry, The Emperor's Sword. Have I been saying Soul this whole time? I really hope I haven't been saying Soul this whole time. The Emperor's Sword. Um, it was really good. It really, really, really was. I want to put it in cream of the crop at the very bottom here because I did enjoy it so much and it is in my favorites shelf on Goodreads. But I think I'm gonna put it at pretty dang good at the very top because it is like barely below that threshold because it is just popcorny enough of a story that I feel like I can't put it in cream of the crop and feel like it's justified, even though I can do that with The Last Olympian for whatever reason, but that's probably also my nostalgia speaking to some extent with that one. But yeah, Emperor's Sword was surprisingly good. Oh, and speaking of Riordan, since I just brought up The Last Olympian, The Red Pyramid, which is book 1 in the King Chronicles trilogy. This was a series that I read in middle school that I remembered next to nothing about. I recalled a few specific moments from The Red Pyramid, especially from the beginning of it, and then I remembered like 1 or 2 moments or scenes from the last 2 books, and that was it. So, even though I was technically rereading the King Chronicles this year, a lot of it was new enough that it almost felt like a first time read to a certain extent. And truthfully, that was kind of cool because Red Pyramid, at least, is a very great example of the way that Riordan can do an introduction to a series that very much feels like an introduction to a series, but is self contained enough to be read on its own. Like, you could technically read the Red Pyramid on its own and have enough of an enclosed arc that you could justify not reading the last 2 books. You would be missing a lot of stuff, surely, like, absolutely, especially with the overall thread with the specific enemy. But the arc that is introduced and resolved within the Red Pyramid on its own is so good that you could technically read it on its own, and it is still a very good book. And for that, I have to give it major props. I'm going to put it just above The Titan's Curse because it is, it's very good. And it sets up the whole trilogy super well, but it is not like the most incredible thing that I've ever read. It isn't even as good as The Last Olympian at all, but it is still very good in my opinion. And I think the way that Riordan tends to do first person narrations, and Percy Jackson is obviously very iconic and great narrator, but having 2 first person narrators in King Chronicles works super well for the way that he told this story, and spoiler alert for the way that he told the other 2 books in the trilogy as well. Now, let's get into the final book that I'm going to talk about in this part of this tier list, being The Picture of Dorian Gray by, oh, what is the author? I can't see it in the image. Who's the author? Oscar Wilde, that's the author. The Picture of Dorian Gray is one that I'm going to upset a friend with because I mean he already knows that I wasn't the biggest fan of it. It has a lot of great ideas and a few great moments, but even with as short as The Picture of Dorian Gray is, I think it's too long. There were a couple moments of it that just felt really bloated and drawn out, including and especially chapter 11, at least of my edition of it, since there are several different versions of the story, where chapter 11 was almost all just Wild talking about random objects and stuff that I will admit I skimmed heavily several paragraphs of that chapter. Like that chapter was like 25 pages and like 5 of those pages had anything to do with the story at all. And a lot of people really like Wilde's prose, and that's one of the reasons that they tend to love this book. I did not find anything special about Wilde's prose, so even reading that chapter was a pain in my butt. I skimmed it so heavily I might as well have skipped that chapter. I will admit. Like, I'm not ashamed of admitting that either, but it was such a boring chapter. It was putting me to sleep every other sentence. And that was, granted, you could blame part of that on my wisdom teeth, because that was when I got my wisdom teeth taken out and I was recovering from that when I was reading this book. But I also read The Red Pyramid, a lot of that, when I was recovering from my wisdom teeth as well, and I did not have nearly as much issues with that, obviously. The Picture of Dorian Gray, like I said, has a few great moments and scenes and several great ideas that thematically are very, very, very interesting and intriguing. However, I don't think they paid off super well. I don't recall the ending of this book very well because at least I don't recall it wrapping things up in a way that I found super satisfying. Like, this book had a few chapters at the very beginning that were great, a couple chapters in the very middle that were great. Oh yeah, and then the 1 or 2 chapters at the end were actually pretty good. But then there was a lot of fluff and stuff in the middle that just kind of decreased and lessened the impact of it overall in ways that I wasn't super satisfied with. I could see myself enjoying this more in a reread. Given that I would probably be looking for different stuff from it, I would be reading it specifically for what Oscar Wilde's trying to say rather than what story he is telling. Um, but as of this moment, I did not particularly enjoy Picture of Dorian Gray. I'm going to put it at the very top of Better Luck Next Time. This, similar to Obscene Bird of Night, is one that I could see myself reading again in the future, and potentially enjoying or at least appreciating more than I did the first time around. But as of this first read, I wasn't super into it. But that is going to be the end of part 3 of this tier list. I only went through another 9 entries, but we're running a little bit long again as usual. So thank you guys for joining me on part 3 of this tier list. Let me know what you thought of my picks. How much more are you raging even more than last week? Because wow, I'm getting kind of crazy with some of this ranking, to be honest. Like, I'm even surprising myself with where some of these things are placed, but given the overall ranking, I'm not necessarily super disagreeing with myself on any of it either. So let me know what you think of this video and this part of the tier list. I'll be back again. I don't believe it will be next week. Let me check. Yeah, on Monday, or sorry, not Monday, on this coming Tuesday, on episode 58 of the Book Binge, I'll be doing my January reading wrap up and February TBR. So obviously join me for those. Those videos are always fun to make and talk about because I get, I get to talk about what I have been reading, what I will read, all of that, whatnot. And the next Thursday will be my January book haul video, so I will not be doing another part of the tier list until the Thursday after that. So come back in 2 weeks for part 4 of the tier list. Thank you guys for watching again. As always, I'll be back again in the next one.